They say a monstrous man lives atop Pine Hollow, tall as a tree, silent as stone, with the face carved by sorrow. Years ago, a cruel father dragged his daughter into those woods and left her behind, calling her too ugly to love. But the mountain did not eat her. It sheltered her in the arms of the very giant they all feared. Now, years later, that same father returns with a lawyer, a smile, and a secret. Why does he want her back? What is he hiding? And will the only man who ever protected her lose her forever? When a forgotten child becomes the heart of a giant's redemption and a father's return threatens to unravel it all, one question echoes through the pines. Who gets to claim a soul once left behind? And who truly knows what love looks like? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this aren't just fiction. They're reflections of the values we still hold dear. If you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the power of chosen family, then you're already part of this journey. Drop a comment with the state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thunder cracked across the sky as if the heavens themselves were splitting open. Rain fell in violent sheets, soaking the earth and turning the forest path into a slurry of mud and leaves. A wagon creaked to a halt near the tree line, its wheels half sunken in the wet soil. From the seat, a man climbed down, broad-shouldered with eyes like flint and a mouth set in permanent scorn. In his grip, a child squirmed. She couldn't have been more than 7. Hair tangled with briars, cheeks bruised from days of neglect. Her bare feet dangled above the cold ground. She made no sound, not even when her father dropped her into the mud. Her only possession was a blanket, a once pink scrap now ragged and stained, that she clung to as if it were life itself. "You're more trouble than you're worth," the man growled, voice sharp as a whip. "Ugly as sin, just like your mother. Ain't nobody gonna want a girl like you." His words struck harder than the storm. Without another glance, he spat in the dirt and turned back to the wagon, reins in hand. The horses neighed uneasily as lightning lit up the sky. A moment later, he was gone, wheels churning through the mud, vanishing down the path from which they'd come. The child didn't cry. Not because she wasn't afraid. Her bones trembled, her lips quivered, but because crying was a luxury she had long been punished for. She pulled the blanket tighter around her small shoulders and turned toward the dark trees, the only shelter from the wind. Her name was Mara, though no one had spoken it kindly in years. She walked. With every step, the forest deepened. Branches reached like fingers, and the storm's rage was muffled beneath the canopy. Her breath came in shallow pants. Leaves clung to her legs. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Mara froze, listening, but her feet would not carry her back to the road. There was no one there. There had never been anyone. She stumbled over a root and fell face first into the undergrowth. Mud filled her mouth. She coughed, wiped her eyes, and crawled forward. Her blanket snagged on a thorn bush. She tugged, frantic, tearing a hole through its center, but she didn't stop. Mara pressed on through the wet darkness, driven by something ancient, older than fear, older than hope, the need to survive. An owl hooted above her. The trees whispered. Thunder rolled again. She didn't know how long she wandered, minutes, maybe hours, before her legs finally gave out. Her body crumpled beside a moss-covered rock, and for a moment, the forest was still. Her eyes fluttered shut. Rain kissed her cheeks. From the shadows, unseen, a figure watched. Towering and silent, he had eyes like worn steel and a beard thick as bramble. The townsfolk called him a ghost, a giant, a devil in the mountains. He didn't move at first, just stared, and then, slowly, he stepped forward. The storm raged on, but for the first time in her life, Mara was no longer alone. The storm faded into a drizzling hush by morning, but the forest held its breath. Damp leaves clung to Mara's arms as she stirred, her blanket half buried in mud, her limbs stiff and cold. Her stomach ached with hunger, but worse than that was the emptiness, deeper than her belly, deeper than her bones. She sat up slowly, eyes scanning the trees, nothing but silence and the slow drip of rain from the canopy above. She remembered the man in the dark, or thought she did, a shape, a shadow. Eyes watching her before sleep pulled her under, but there was no one now. Only the soft press of moss beneath her palms and a faint animal scent in the air, earthy and wild. A distant growl echoed through the trees. Mara froze, heart galloping. Something large moved beyond the ferns. Her breath hitched. Was it a bear? A wolf? She crouched low, clutching what remained of her torn blanket. Her fingers trembled. The stories came back then, the ones she'd heard whispered in the alleyways behind the tavern or hissed by women at the well, when they thought no children were listening. They spoke of a man who wasn't quite a man. They said he lived alone in the highlands, up past where the rivers forked, and the trees grew twisted. He stood taller than any man should, with shoulders like stone and a face lost behind a beard thick as hanging moss. His eyes, they claimed, were cold steel, sharp enough to freeze the breath in your lungs. Some said he'd been a soldier once. Others swore he'd been a killer, cursed by God and cast into the woods. Children who got too close to the edge of the forest were warned, if the mountain doesn't take you, he will. And yet, no one had ever seen him clearly, only shapes in the mist, only rumors and footprints too large to be normal. He was a myth built out of fear and loneliness, a shadow stitched together by a town that didn't understand solitude. Mara stepped carefully between roots, eyes wide, ears sharper than ever. The animal sounds followed her, low rustles, clicking branches, a sudden snort that made her leap behind a fallen log. Something galloped off into the underbrush. She didn't move for minutes. The hunger gnawed at her again. She pulled at the blanket, wrapped it tighter, though it gave no warmth. Her legs ached. Her lips were cracked. Still, she kept walking because to stop was to be swallowed. At one point, she found a narrow path, hardly more than a game trail, marked by heavy, sunken prints in the mud, far larger than any man's boot. She hesitated, then stepped into them, one foot after the other. They led uphill toward the ridgeline where clouds still hugged the trees. Branches scraped her arms. Once, a squirrel shrieked and bolted past her. She nearly screamed in reply. As the forest thickened, so did the silence. It was a different kind of quiet now, heavy, watching, filled with the kind of stillness that only follows grief. The kind that waits, not with malice, but with warning. Mara stopped at the foot of a steep incline, staring up at a ridge crowned with mist. Somewhere beyond that line of trees, the stories said, the giant lived. She didn't know if her feet would carry her all the way, but she knew she couldn't turn back. So she kept going, step after trembling step, toward the man the world had tried to forget. The path grew steeper as Mara climbed, her feet raw and torn, her breath shallow and broken. The forest thinned the higher she went, but the air thickened with mist and cold. It wrapped around her like a ghost's breath, hiding the sky and swallowing sound. The prints in the mud had long since vanished, but she followed instinct now, or perhaps something older, something that tugged at her feet and whispered, "Keep going." Her fingers brushed the wet bark of a tree as she stumbled forward. The blanket hung from one shoulder, tattered beyond recognition. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, her skin hot with fever. Still, she pressed on. She didn't know why, except that stopping felt like death. When the trail curved around a jagged rise of rock, her knees buckled. She fell hard, cheek against stone, blood smearing her chin. For a moment she lay there, too tired to cry, too cold to move. Her eyes flickered shut. All around her, the mountain held its silence. Then something shifted. It began as a vibration in the ground, so faint she wasn't sure it was real. A sound followed, slow, deliberate footsteps pressing into earth. Not the scurry of deer or the skitter of foxes. This was heavier, older, more certain. Mara tried to lift her head. She could barely open her eyes. From the mist ahead, a shape began to form. First a blur, then the solid outline of a man, tall beyond reason. He stepped out from behind a cluster of pines, the fog parting around him as if it dared not touch his shoulders. His coat was patched leather, faded and worn, hanging from his massive frame like a cloak. His beard, long and tangled, moved slightly in the wind. His face was carved from years of silence and storms, hard lines, sun-browned skin, and eyes the color of winter iron. He said nothing. He simply stood there, boots planted firm, arms by his sides, watching her. Mara's breath caught. Fear and awe warred in her chest. This was the man from the stories, the one the townsfolk warned of, the one they called monster, ghost, demon. And yet, she felt no fear of him, not the kind her father stirred, not the cold violence of cruelty. This was different. Heavy, yeah, intimidating, but not cruel. His eyes, though distant, were not empty. They saw her. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her vision swam. The cold overtook her limbs. Her body sagged against the rock. She fainted. The man moved. In 3 strides, he was beside her. He crouched, slow and deliberate, and studied her face. Mud, bruises, and blood. A child, alone in the mountains, abandoned, not lost, left. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. With surprising gentleness, he slipped one arm beneath her legs and the other around her back. She weighed almost nothing in his grasp. Her head lolled against his chest as he stood. The mist swallowed them as he turned and walked up the mountain, carrying her into the place where no one dared go. His home. The first thing Mara noticed was warmth, not the soft warmth of a feather bed or a mother's arms. She had no memory of either, but a deep, steady heat that came from the thick logs around her, from the stones under her back, and from the fire that crackled softly somewhere near. She blinked against the low amber light, her lashes sticky with dried tears and mud. The ceiling above her was wood, dark and sturdy, cross-beamed and solid. Shadows danced across it from a hearth fire she couldn't yet see. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Her heart stirred with fear. She sat up too quickly and dizziness swarmed her. The blanket, clean and woolen, not hers, slipped from her shoulders. She was lying on a bedroll, placed atop a thick bearskin rug. Her hands, though scraped, had been washed. Her feet were wrapped in cloth. The ragged shreds of her old blanket lay folded in the corner of the room as though someone knew it mattered. Then she heard the creak of a chair. Her eyes turned. In the far corner near the fire, he sat. The man was still as stone, a mountain folded into human shape. He faced the fire, legs planted wide, hands resting on his knees. His coat hung on a peg by the door, revealing a thick shirt stretched across broad shoulders. His beard glinted red in the firelight. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. The silence was so thick it felt alive. Mara's stomach growled, a hollow, aching sound that broke the stillness like a pebble in a pond. The man stood without a word, crossed to the iron pot that hung above the fire, and ladled stew into a tin bowl. Steam rose in gentle spirals. He carried it to her with both hands, crouched, and placed it on the wooden floor beside her bedroll. Still, he said nothing. She stared at him, unsure whether to speak, unsure what might happen if she did. His face was unreadable, weathered, worn, but not cruel. His eyes, those steel-colored eyes from the stories, held something strange. Not pity, not softness, but a deep, unmovable sadness, like a man who had watched too many winters pass. She looked down at the bowl. carrots, potatoes, venison. It smelled like everything her life had never been. Her hand shook as she reached for the spoon. She expected him to pull the bowl back or bark at her, but he only rose and returned to his chair. The first taste burned her tongue, but she didn't stop. She ate fast, then slower, savoring every bite. Each swallow eased the tightness in her chest. The man said nothing. He didn't look at her. He simply stared into the fire, the light flickering across his face like the wind brushing worn stone. She finished the bowl and set it down quietly. Still silence, but this silence was different from the one her father gave her. It wasn't full of threat or punishment. It wasn't dangerous. It was simply quiet, deep and lonely, yes, but not mean. She watched him, trying to understand. And though he didn't speak, didn't even glance her way, she understood something that words couldn't teach. He was not a monster. He was broken. And in that cabin of silence, something small and strange began to grow. A fragile thread between them, thin as spider silk, invisible but real. The next morning, the cabin was filled with pale mountain light, filtered through a single square window. Mara sat on the bearskin, now draped in a soft linen shirt that hung nearly to her knees. Her body still ached, but the fever had broken. She was clean, warm, and for the first time in memory, safe. The mountain man moved with deliberate steps, pouring water into a kettle and placing it over the fire without a word. She watched him carefully, unsure what to expect. Would he send her away now that she could walk? Would he scold her for being in his home? But he did neither. Instead, he pointed toward the stone threshold of the cabin door, then to the far wall, where a thick wooden door stood closed with a rusted iron latch. "Don't go past the river," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel. "And don't open that door." Mara stared at the door, then back at him. She nodded. He regarded her for a long moment, then added, not unkindly, "Child." It was the first time she'd been called anything close to a name in years. Not girl, not it, just child, simple. Not warm, not cold, just real. She clung to it like a thread of sunlight. The days that followed slipped by in a rhythm as slow and quiet as the man himself. Each morning, he rose before the sun, chopped wood outside while the mist still clung to the trees, and came back with arms full of logs. He'd place them beside the hearth, then hand her a cup of warm broth or stew without speaking. She ate. He watched the fire. They did not speak much, but in that silence, something began to take shape. He taught her with actions. When he swept the floor, he handed her the broom next. When he stacked firewood, he made space for her to try. She was clumsy at first, but he never mocked her, never sighed in impatience. He simply waited and then showed her again. One afternoon, after he had gone to chop wood, Mara found a stack of old paper in a drawer near the hearth, yellowed and curling at the corners. She used a stick of charcoal from the fire and began to draw. Her first sketches were shaky. Trees, birds, the cabin window. But when she looked up and saw a squirrel perched outside, she drew it too. Big eyes, crooked tail, the shape of its tiny claws on the sill. When the mountain man returned and saw the paper, he didn't scold her. He looked at the drawing, said nothing, and pinned it on the wall with a nail. That was enough. Every day after, she drew. Each picture joined the first. Quiet little testimonies of a girl learning to live. Deer, mountains, stars, the back of his coat, her feet in the snow. Her hands grew steadier, her lines more sure. She began to smile, just little ones at first, when she fed the hens out back or when a wild fox passed without fear. He noticed. Once, while she slept, he repaired the hem of her shirt with thick but careful stitches. The door to the far room remained locked, and the river beyond the clearing remained unexplored. She did not test the rules, not out of fear but respect. He had given her space, food, warmth, everything she'd never been granted. In return, she honored his silence. She didn't know his name, and he never asked hers. But when he called her child, it was with a weight that meant more than any name she'd ever known. And in that cabin, high on the mountain, the ghosts of sorrow began, quietly, to make room for the breath of something new. The wind that night was sharp, slipping through the gaps in the shutters and carrying with it the mournful song of the forest. Mara lay on the bedroll near the hearth, her drawings tucked neatly beside her, the fire burning low. She had grown used to the sounds of the mountain, the hoot of owls, the rustling of trees, even the occasional distant cry of a coyote. But this sound was different. It was human. A low, ragged breath, a muffled voice, a sound like someone trying not to be heard. She sat up slowly, her heartbeat quickening. The mountain man had disappeared into the far room hours ago, locking the heavy wooden door behind him as he always did. She had never questioned it. The rules were clear. Don't go past the river. Don't open that door. But now, in the hush of night, she heard him weeping. Not loud, not uncontrolled, just quiet, steady sorrow, like something that had lived in him too long to be loud anymore. Mara crept from her bedroll, bare feet silent on the wood floor. The fire cast soft shadows, flickering light against the walls. She stepped closer to the forbidden door, the one with the rusted latch and the faint scent of cedar behind it. Her fingers hovered near the edge but didn't touch. Instead, she lowered herself and pressed her ear to the gap between the door and the floor. He was speaking. At first, the words were too low to understand. Then, a name, Clara, drifted through the crack, followed by a trembling whisper. I should have been there. Another silence, then a sob that broke like a wave against stone. Mara's throat tightened. She had never seen him afraid, never heard him speak more than a sentence. He moved like a man made of mountains, his silence as vast as the sky. But behind that door, he was something else, small, grieving, cracked open by memory. The latch clicked. She scrambled back, heart pounding, and ducked behind the woodpile near the hearth. The door creaked open just enough for light to spill out, gold and dusty and strange. She peered through a gap between logs. Inside, the room was simple. A single bed, neatly made, a worn rocking chair, a chest at the foot of the bed. But what caught her eye was the portrait. It leaned against the far wall, framed in carved wood. A woman with kind eyes and soft hair. In her arms, a baby, both smiling, both gone. The mountain man sat on the floor before the chair, his head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. His shoulders shook, but he made no sound now. The firelight from within the room lit his face differently, gentler, almost human. And in that moment, Mara understood. He wasn't just alone. He was haunted. She watched for only a moment more before slipping back to her bedroll. She didn't sleep. The next morning, he emerged as always, silent, composed, unchanged. But something had shifted. When he handed her the bowl of stew, his eyes lingered a moment longer. He didn't speak of the night, neither did she, but now she knew. The locked door held more than a room. It held memory, love, loss, and the kind of pain that silence could never truly keep out. The days grew longer as spring crept over the mountain, softening the ice that had clung to tree limbs and loosening the soil beneath the cabin. The river, swollen with snowmelt, sang louder now, but Mara did not cross it. She remembered the rules. Still, she wandered the clearing around the cabin with growing confidence, her steps no longer fearful but curious. The mountain man had begun to speak. Not much, never more than necessary. But when he did, it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like an invitation. One morning, after she swept the floor and tidied the hearth, he stepped outside and rested an axe against the chopping block. He pointed to it. You try. Mara blinked at him, then glanced at the axe. She was small, her arms thin, but she nodded. He stood nearby, watching without hovering. Her first swing was awkward, the second even worse. The axe stuck sideways in the log, and she grunted, frustrated. Without a word, he took the axe, split the log clean in one blow, then placed another upright. Again. So she tried. Again. And again. He never raised his voice, never mocked her mistakes. He just stood nearby, correcting her grip, adjusting her stance with a tap of his finger on her elbow or shoulder. When she finally split a log clean through, he gave a single nod and walked back toward the woodpile. She followed, grinning through the sweat on her brow. Another day, he brought her to the river's edge, not across, just along, and showed her how to tie a line with bait. They sat in silence, feet dangling over the rocks, the line drifting in the cold water. She watched him watch the line, patient as a stone. When a fish tugged, he handed her the rod and guided her hands. The fish flopped wildly when she reeled it in, silver and alive, and she laughed, the sound startling even herself. That night, he cooked the fish with herb boudinkin from the slope and placed the fillet on her plate without comment. She ate it with pride. In the evenings, they read. He had a trunk filled with books, old ones, their spines worn, and pages yellow. She struggled with the letters at first, but he pointed to words, sounding them out slowly, gruffly. When she stumbled, he waited. When she succeeded, he said, "Good." Just that. And one night, after she read a full page without help, he said something else. "Mara?" She looked up from the book, startled. He didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. He had never spoken her name before. It sounded rough from his mouth, shaped by years of silence, but it was real. Solid. Horan. The next day, she drew a picture of the two of them sitting by the river, the fish leaping on the line. She pinned it on the wall beside her others. When he saw it, he paused, then picked up a wooden nail and tapped it firmly into the beam to secure it. He didn't smile, but the lines of his face shifted just slightly, like ice beginning to melt beneath sunlight. And Mara, heart full, drew another. The fire cracked low in the hearth, casting soft golden light across the cabin walls. Mara sat cross-legged on the bearskin rug, her sketchbook open across her lap, a half-finished drawing of a raven perched on a branch staring up at her with wide, watchful eyes. Outside, the wind whispered against the logs, but inside all was warm and still. The mountain man sat in his usual chair, his hands resting heavy on his knees. He had just finished reading aloud from the same weathered book they'd been working through for weeks, his deep voice rolling over the old words like a slow-moving stream. When he closed it, silence settled in. Mara looked up from her drawing. She had been thinking of it for days now, unsure if it was right to ask. But something had shifted between them. She knew his moods, like she knew the sound of each bird outside the cabin. Tonight, he wasn't distant. He was still. "Why did you come here?" she asked softly. "Why do you live alone?" The question hung in the air. The fire popped. He didn't move, not even to glance at her. For a moment she thought he might not answer at all, but then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared into the flames. And there was a long silence before he spoke. "There was a fire," he said. His voice was lower than usual, almost like it belonged to someone else. "It was my house, my wife, Clara, and my son, Jacob. He'd just turned 2. He rubbed his hand over his face. The flames flickered, reflecting in his steel-gray eyes. "I was in the field chopping wood. Wind shifted, the chimney caught, or maybe it was the lamp. Don't matter now. By the time I saw the smoke, the roof was already gone." His breath hitched, barely audible. "I ran, screamed, tried to break the door down, but the beams collapsed. I couldn't get in, couldn't save them." Mara's pencil slipped from her fingers. She didn't speak. She couldn't. He sat back in the chair. his face in shadow. People said it wasn't my fault, said I did all I could, but I knew better. I built the house. I lit the lamp. I was the one who didn't come fast enough. So I left. The cabin seemed to shrink around his words, the air heavy with the weight of everything he had carried alone. I walked north until I couldn't hear their voices anymore. Built this place with my own hands. Figured if I couldn't be a husband or a father, I'd be nothing at all. Just wood and stone, quiet, alone. Mara reached for her sketchbook, now closed beside her. She didn't know what to say, but she slid it across the floor toward him. On the open page was a drawing she had finished earlier that week. A small cabin under a wide mountain sky, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. 2 figures sat by the river, side by side. He looked at it for a long time. I didn't expect to find anything up here, he said finally. But then you came. Mara didn't respond with words. She just reached for the poker and gently stirred the coals, sending sparks swirling upward, soft as fireflies. For the first time since she had come to this place, the silence between them was not just a space. It was an understanding. The town of Rivers Hollow was small enough that news moved faster than the river, carried on the backs of gossip and suspicion. Folks had long spoken of the man who lived high in the mountains, the one who'd left after the fire, the one who never came back. Over time, he had become less a man and more a myth, a cautionary tale told to children and muttered about behind hands at the churchyard. But myths don't walk into town. Myths don't appear at the edge of the general store once every few months, trading pelts for salt and matches. And myths don't take in little girls. The whispers began one market day when old Hank Rollins saw the child. She had come with the mountain man, standing behind him like a shadow. He had brought his usual bundles of rabbit and deer skin, bartered quietly as always. But the girl, barefoot, hair wild as bramble, eyes wide like a fawn, had stared at the barrels of apples like she didn't know what they were. She looked half animal. Hank told his wife, who told the seamstress, who told the baker, who told the preacher. By nightfall, the whole town knew. Some said she was a foundling. Others said she'd escaped from somewhere dark, maybe even from him. Some believed he'd snatched her right out of her home and was keeping her up there like a secret. One man at the tavern, already deep in drink, swore she had claw marks on her arms and refused to blink when spoken to. She don't talk, just stares, he insisted, like she's not right in the head. They say she draws strange pictures, murmured another. Dark things. Maybe he's teaching her that. The whispers took root. Parents clutched their children closer when they passed the edge of the woods. Boys dared each other to go to the tree line and call out his name. Women at the church said the child should be brought down, examined, prayed over, but not everyone joined the tide. In a cottage near the edge of town lived a woman named Elspeth, known to most as the midwife. She had delivered nearly half the children in Rivers Hollow and had never feared speaking when others held their tongues. She remembered the mountain man, not the ghost from the stories, but the man from before with calloused hands and kind eyes, holding his young wife's elbow gently as they crossed the street. She remembered the fire, too. She remembered how no one had spoken to him after. Not to comfort, not to forgive, only to turn away. When the talk grew too loud, Elsbeth stepped into the center of the church after Sunday service, her back straight, her eyes hard. Y'all forget too quick, she said. You'd rather believe a child's been stolen than think kindness could still live in a man's heart. I knew him before you painted him with fear. He loved once. He lost everything. And if that girl's with him, then I trust she's safer than she's ever been. Some nodded, some shifted uncomfortably, some whispered still. But from that day, there was a line drawn, not in law, not in blood, but in the hearts of the townspeople. On one side were those who feared what they didn't understand. On the other, those who dared to believe that broken men could still protect and that lost children might finally be found. The years had passed gently like snowmelt winding through the valley. Mara was no longer the thin, shivering child who had wandered the woods with a torn blanket and a hollow belly. She stood taller now, her limbs strong from chopping wood, and her hands steady from years of drawing. Her hair fell in dark waves to her shoulders, often tied back with a strip of cloth, and her eyes, once wary, now held quiet, knowing. The cabin was still small, still silent, but filled now with warmth, the kind built not from fire alone, but from routine, trust, and something like love. The mountain man still said little. He rose early, worked hard, and listened when Mara spoke, even if his replies were brief. She had long since stopped needing his approval in words. A nod was enough. A glance toward the drawings pinned on the wall, a second helping of stew. These were his ways of speaking. It was a late autumn afternoon when the sound of hooves echoed through the trees. Sharp, out of place, wrong. Mara was tending to the garden, pulling the last stubborn roots of carrot from the soil, when she heard it. The trail that led up to the cabin was steep and rarely used by anyone but deer and wind. But now came the unmistakable groan of wagon wheels, the snap of reins, the clatter of iron-shod horses. She straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. The mountain man had already stepped from the cabin, axe in hand, not raised, just held with the calm readiness of a man who trusted few. The wagon crested the bend in the trail, fine and lacquered, pulled by two glossy chestnut mares. On the bench sat a man dressed in a dark wool coat with brass buttons, his hair slicked, his boots polished, a silver pocket watch glinted on his chest. His face was leaner than she remembered, but the eyes were the same, cold, assessing, sharpened by self-interest. He climbed down as if the mountain itself should bow beneath him. "Is that her?" he asked, voice rich and hollow. "Mara?" She didn't speak. She didn't move. Something ancient stirred in her chest, something that recoiled. "I'll be taking her now," he continued, glancing at the mountain man without acknowledgement. "You've done your part. Raised her up. Fed her, I suppose. But blood's blood. Her place is with her kin." The mountain man said nothing. His grip on the axe didn't tighten. His face didn't change. But his presence filled the clearing like thunder waiting. Mara stepped forward slowly. "What do you want?" she asked. Her father smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've remarried. Fine woman, educated, proper. We have a house in the city, but no children, and people talk, you see. They ask about the girl I lost. It would be good, respectable to bring you home. New name, new clothes, new life." Mara stared at him. 1,000 memories crawled behind her ribs. Mud, bruises, silence. Being left behind like refuse. Being called a thing, ugly, worthless. "I'm not yours," she said. His face twitched. "I am," she continued, voice steady. "Where I belong." He looked past her, then toward the cabin, toward the man beside her. And for the first time, something like uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the wind swept between them, cold and clear. And Mara did not move. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, humming with things unspoken. The wind stirred the hem of Mara's dress, rustled the pine needles overhead, and still her father stood there, one polished boot resting in the muddy trail, as though he expected the earth to give way at his arrival. He glanced toward the cabin, nose wrinkling slightly. "So this is where you've been living all these years, hiding up here like some wild thing?" Mara didn't flinch. The mountain man remained by the door, arms crossed, gaze steady. He hadn't said a word since the stranger arrived, and his silence pressed harder than any threat. The man in the wool coat gave a shallow laugh and brushed something from his lapel. "Well, it explains the look of you at least. Dirt under your nails, hair like a briar patch. We'll fix that soon enough. Mara's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. He turned back to her then, all practiced charm. My wife, Helen, is a good woman, gentle, refined. She's well connected, knows people in the city. We host gatherings, luncheons, all that. But people ask questions. Where's the daughter from your first marriage? They say, what happened to the child? And I've had to say things I'd rather not say because I thought you were gone. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that always preceded a lie. But here you are, alive, if not exactly polished. And it got me thinking. A reunion, it would look good. We could spin it. A story of redemption, of father's forgiveness. The world loves that kind of tale. You'd be proof that I'm a changed man, that I cared. His voice caught on the word, like it tasted strange. I don't want your story, Mara said flatly. He chuckled again. I don't think you understand. This isn't a request. I've already spoken to a man in the city. He's a lawyer, a friend, very sharp. He tells me that legally, you're still mine. You were never properly adopted, never made a ward of the court. There's no record of you being claimed by anyone, which means, in the eyes of the law, you belong to me. At that, the mountain man stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't brandish the axe that still leaned against the wall beside him. He simply came to stand beside Mara, a presence of stone and storm. The man's smile faltered for a moment. What is this? He scoffed. You think you can keep her here like a stray? You're no father. You're a myth, a mistake. People say you lost your mind after the fire, that you built yourself a prison out of wood and silence, and now you're playing house with some wild girl you found in the mud? The insult hung in the air. The mountain man didn't speak, but his stillness sharpened, his eyes narrowing like the coming of snow. I have money, the man continued, voice sharpening. Influence. What do you have? A shack and a sad story. You're nothing, and you're not going to stop me. But Mara didn't step back. She stood her ground, chin high, heart burning with all the years she had grown from girl to woman without him, and beside her, the mountain man remained silent, but solid as the mountain that bore his name. Whatever storm was coming, it would not find them unready. The wagon stayed at the edge of the clearing all night, its dark shape casting long shadows beneath the moonlight. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, but Mara sat awake near the hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees. The words her father had spoken still lingered in the corners of the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. Dresses, music, warmth, city lights, a room of her own. Education, fine things. Her name restored. She had dreamed of such things once, before the mountain, before safety. She had imagined herself clean and wanted, her hair brushed, her face seen. She had imagined someone calling her beautiful and meaning it. Now those things had been offered, handed out like sweets from the hand of a man who had once cast her away, like a broken toy. The mountain man sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, practiced strokes. The sound of stone against steel was steady, like a heartbeat, grounding. He hadn't said much after her father left, hadn't tried to persuade her one way or the other, but Mara could see the weight in his shoulders, the way his hands were slower tonight, the way his eyes kept drifting to the window, where the wagon sat waiting like a specter. She cleared her throat. He said I'd have a room. Books, a school, maybe. He looked up, but didn't speak. He said people would notice me, like I mattered, like I could be part of something bigger, that I could have more than this. Her voice was quiet, but not uncertain. Still, he remained silent. Do you think he's lying? She asked. He set the knife and whetstone aside, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. I think he believes what he's saying, and I think he only believes it when it serves him. Mara looked at the fire. But what if I want that? What if I want to be someone different? You can, he said. You already are. The silence settled again, deeper now, heavy with unspoken truths. You won't stop me, she said. He shook his head once. Number, I won't. She blinked. For some reason, she had expected him to argue, to hold out his hand, to say something that would anchor her in place. But instead, he gave her only the truth. I didn't find you to keep you, he continued. You weren't mine to begin with. I didn't want you to be alone. Her throat tightened. But I wasn't. No, he said softly. You weren't. The fire cracked. The walls of the cabin glowed with a gentle warmth, lit by years of memories, laughter, drawing, learning, quiet meals, healing without words. She looked at the chair he'd built for her by the window, the stack of drawings pinned on the walls, the garden outside. The cabin wasn't grand, but it was full of her. Outside, the wagon waited, sleek and empty. Inside, the man who had never asked for her, never demanded, never threatened, simply waited, offering nothing but the freedom to choose. She felt the tension settle deep in her chest, a pull between what was promised and what had already been proven. And she knew, as the flames flickered between them, that whatever she chose, this place would never stop being home. The midwife's hands were weathered but strong, like bark that had withstood every season. Elsbeth sat at the edge of her porch, a tin cup of tea in her palm and a folded piece of parchment in her apron pocket. Mara stood before her, dust clinging to her skirt from the walk down the mountain, eyes full of something between hope and dread. Behind her, the sky hung low and gray, like it too was waiting for what the letter held. I should have given this to you sooner, Elsbeth said, but sometimes the truth needs the right time or the right weight behind it. You've got both now. Mara took the letter with careful fingers. The paper was thin, creased from years of being hidden and unfolded and hidden again. The ink had faded, but her mother's name still curled at the top, like a whisper from the past. Clara Wren. She sat on the edge of the porch steps, hands trembling as she unfolded it. Elsbeth said nothing more. She just sipped her tea and let the wind do the talking. Mara, my girl, the letter began. If this ever reaches you, it means I've failed to get you free on my own. I hope someone kind finds you. I hope you know none of this was your fault. Mara blinked hard, swallowing the lump in her throat. Your father was not always cruel. Once I believed in him, but power and anger grow in silence, and I kept too many silences. The bruises started after you were born. I tried to shield you. He called you strange, said your eyes made him feel watched. He said you were ugly, that I'd cursed him by birthing you, but I knew better. I saw in you the spark of something unbreakable. Tears blurred the words. She wiped them away and kept reading. There was one man who tried to help, a friend from town before he went quiet. Tall, gentle in the way only wounded men are. He saw the fear in me. He offered shelter. But your father found out, said I was cheating him. He waited until I was alone and made sure I never stood up again. The man tried to come back. He begged the townsfolk to believe him, to stop the funeral, to demand justice. But no one would listen. They blamed him for meddling, said he'd shamed a family. He disappeared after that. I heard he built a cabin in the mountains. I pray he finds peace. I pray he finds you. The letter ended with a line that pierced like a blade. If you ever find him, Trust him. He knew your worth before the world did. Mara sat in silence, the letter folded in her lap, the wind threading through her hair. Elsbeth placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and warm. Your mother came to me once, she said. She had broken ribs and hope in her hands. I should have done more, but he, your father, had the law on his side, and she had nothing but you, that man, the one who tried to help. He didn't just disappear, he was cast out by fear, by cowardice, and he never once defended himself. Mara rose slowly, the letter clutched to her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The ache in her chest had reshaped itself, not just pain now, but clarity. She turned toward the trail, the path home, the place where the truth had always lived in silence, waiting for her to see it. The mountain called, not with force, but with a quiet, aching grace. And this time, she would walk toward it, not as a lost child, but as a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. The old bell above Rivel's Hollow Town Hall hadn't rung in years, not for a celebration, not for a warning. It took 3 pulls from Elsbeth's wiry arms to get it going, but when it did, the sound rang out clear and true across the valley, calling people from their homes and shops like it had in the days when community still meant something. By sundown, the hall was full. Men leaned against the walls, arms crossed. Women sat in wooden pews once meant for sermons and songs. Children whispered from laps and corners. No one knew quite what the meeting was about, but they all knew who it was about, the mountain man and the girl. Elsbeth stood at the front, hands resting on the back of a chair like it was a pulpit. Years ago, she began, voice steady, a fire took the life of Clara Wren and her boy. The town said it was God's will or bad luck or punishment, but we never looked deeper. We didn't want to. Murmurs rustled through the room like wind through tall grass. We had a man among us. Kind, quiet, strong. He tried to help her, tried to speak up when no one else did, and we let him be turned into something else, a monster, a myth, because it was easier than asking if maybe we were wrong. Heads turned, eyes dropped, guilt stirred like dust on a dry road. Elsbeth held up a letter, yellowed with age. This was written by Clara before she died. It tells the truth about the beatings, about the man she trusted to save her, about the man who took everything from her and who now dares to return and call it justice. Silence held for a long moment until finally old Thomas Beale, the town's miller, cleared his throat. During the flood, 5 winters back, he said, my son went missing. Everyone else was sandbagging the church, but that man, the mountain man, they say, he brought him home. Soaked to the bone, never asked for thanks, just nodded and left. A woman near the back stood. That same year, when we ran out of meat in the freeze, someone left snares full of rabbits on my porch. I thought it was angels, but I saw his tracks in the snow. One by one, the stories came. How he'd mended the preacher's roof in the night. How he'd buried a stranger's dog with his own hands. How the girl, Mara, was not wild at all, but kind, clever, with eyes that saw everything and judged no one. It was as if the mountain had shifted, and now, slowly, the town was shifting with it. Elsbeth stepped forward again. That man gave up his voice when we refused to listen, but he never gave up his decency. We were wrong, and it's time we make it right. A murmur of assent rose like a slow tide. Heads nodded. The pews creaked as neighbors leaned in toward one another, not in fear, but in newfound understanding. The town that had once turned away was beginning at last to look up, to see, and maybe, just maybe, to remember how to stand beside the good they once failed to protect. The church bell rang slow and solemn, not for a funeral or a wedding, but for judgment. The wooden pews groaned under the weight of bodies, farmers, blacksmiths, seamstresses, mothers, children, all pressed together, faces drawn tight with expectation. At the front stood the judge, A gray-bearded man from the county courthouse with eyes that missed nothing and a posture carved from law. Beside him, the preacher sat stiffly, hands folded as though in prayer. Mara sat alone at the front bench, back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore a plain dress, hair pulled back, face composed. She looked neither frightened nor angry, only ready. The mountain man stood at the back of the church, silent as ever, eyes locked on her like an anchor. Her father stood across from her, dressed in a dark coat, silver buttons shining in the morning light that streamed through the church windows. His lawyer, a young man with slicked hair and 2 white teeth, stood beside him, papers neatly stacked in his briefcase. To them, this was a formality, a matter of claim and name, nothing more. The judge struck the gavel gently once. "We're here to determine the rightful guardianship of Mara Wren," he said. "Petitioner is Elias Wren, the girl's biological father. Opposition has been raised by the community of Rivals Hollow. This proceeding will be conducted with respect and evidence." Elias rose first, voice smooth. "Your Honor, I lost my daughter due to unfortunate circumstances and confusion. I was told she had perished. I mourned her. It wasn't until recently I discovered she was alive and living in isolation with a man unfit to care for a child. I only wish to give her a better life in the city with education and opportunity. She's of my blood." The judge nodded. "Your case is clear. Does the opposition have testimony?" Elspeth stood, her voice carried like a river-cutting stone. "I have a letter," she said, placing it in the judge's hand, "written by Clara Wren before her death. In it, she describes the abuse she suffered at Elias's hands and the man who tried to save her, only to be cast out." Gasps murmured through the church. The judge read quietly, then handed the letter to the clerk. "This will be entered into the record. Any other testimony?" One by one, townsfolk stood. Thomas Beale, Widow Mathers, even the preacher. Each offered stories, quiet, steady, undeniable, of the mountain man's care, his decency, his silent acts of compassion. Then Mara rose. She turned to face the room, her voice low but clear. "My father left me in the woods and never looked back. He told me I was too ugly to keep. I don't remember love from him, only fear. But I remember kindness from the man behind me. He never asked for anything. He gave me a name, a home, a life. I am who I am because he didn't see a burden. He saw a child." Elias stepped forward, face red with anger. "She's a child. She doesn't know what's best for her." He moved as if to grab her by the arm, but before he reached her, the mountain man was between them. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke loud enough. The judge raised his hand. "That's enough." The room held its breath. "This court finds in favor of Mara Wren. Full independence, protected status, as Elias Wren's claim is nullified. The evidence is clear." A cheer rose, not loud, but heartfelt. Mara didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just turned, walked toward the man who had always stood behind her, and took his hand. The gavel's final strike echoed through the old church like a thunderclap, not in volume, but in meaning. A sound that marked the end of something bitter and long held. Elias Wren's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. His lawyer turned away first, already stacking papers and sliding them into his briefcase, his face pinched and pale. The judge remained steady, unmoved. "In addition to the ruling," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "this court recognizes a pattern of neglect and abuse. Mr. Wren will be fined by the county for failure to report the child's abandonment and for previous domestic violence, now corroborated by the late Clara Wren's letter and multiple witnesses. Legal collection will begin within the week." Murmurs rippled through the pews, some with satisfaction, some with disbelief that it had taken so long. Elias turned, his face dark with fury and shame. The once proud man, dressed in fine clothes and filled with arrogance, now looked smaller than ever before, swallowed not by the law alone, but by the truth he could no longer twist. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath as he passed Mara, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He was smoke, thin and fading. Outside, the townspeople watched as he climbed into his wagon without help, snapping the reins harder than needed. The horses startled and jerked forward, and within moments, the man who had abandoned a child and tried to reclaim her for appearance and power was gone in a trail of dust and humiliation. The mountain man stood at the edge of the church steps, the brim of his hat low over his brow. For a long time, he said nothing, just watched the path where Elias had vanished. His posture was still, but Mara could see the weight leaving his shoulders in slow, quiet inches. Elsbeth approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "You hungry?" she asked plainly. He glanced at her, surprised. She smiled faintly. "It's been years since you've sat at my table. That's long enough. Supper's hot, and no one's got a better stew than me." There was a long pause. Then, to Mara's astonishment, he gave the smallest of nods. Word spread faster than fire. By the time they reached Elsbeth's home, the table had been set for more than just three. Neighbors filtered in with loaves of bread, jars of preserves, fresh butter, and smoked ham. Not everyone spoke. Not everyone knew what to say. But their presence said enough. The mountain man sat at the head of the long wooden table, shoulders still broad, hands still scarred, but something softer in his eyes now. Not comfort. He had never sought comfort, but permission. Permission to be seen, to be included, to stay. Mara sat beside him, her chair close enough for their elbows to brush. For the first time in years, laughter filled the room. He didn't join in, not quite, but Mara caught the faint curve of his mouth, the rare, shy twitch of a smile hiding behind his beard. And in that room, lit by oil lamps and warmed by something stronger than fire, a man who had once been cast out was welcomed back. Not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as a neighbor, as a protector, as family. The soil was warm beneath their fingers as they knelt side by side in the garden, pressing seeds into the earth with quiet reverence. Mara's dress was stained with dirt, and the mountain man's hands, rough and calloused, moved with the care of someone planting more than just vegetables. Each small seed felt like a promise of a season to come, of life continuing, of something rooted deeper than the soil. They had returned to the cabin in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. The mountain welcomed them home in its own quiet way. The rustling trees, the golden sweep of the wind, the distant echo of the river running strong. The garden rows were straighter now. Mara had taken to mapping them out on paper, drawing tidy boxes and labeling each one. He let her lead. She liked things orderly when she could help it. After a childhood shaped by chaos, there was peace in knowing where the carrots would grow and where the beans would climb, and the townspeople had changed, too. At first, just a few curious souls had followed the narrow trail that led up from Rivel's Hollow, bringing baskets of bread or jars of preserves as excuses. Then came the children. They arrived like birds, laughing, chattering, curious. Mara would look up from her drawing to see them peeking around the trees, hesitant at first, but drawn in by her warm smile and the quiet pull of the mountain's mystery. The mountain man, still silent, still towering, watched them with wary eyes, but never sent them away. One afternoon, he carved a long bench from a fallen cedar and set it near the fire pit. The children gathered there while Mara read aloud from the same book she had once stumbled through in halting whispers. Her voice now was steady, her words clear. They listened, wide-eyed and still. It was the old locked room that changed the most. One morning, without a word, the mountain man walked to the door and pressed the iron key into her hand. Mara held it like it might disappear. The latch creaked when it turned, and the door opened with a sigh. Like something long held was finally ready to breathe. The room was smaller than she remembered from her childhood glimpse. A simple bed, a chair, a wooden chest at the foot of it. Dust clung to everything, but the light filtering in from the window was gentle, golden, forgiving. They cleared it together, lifting out the ghosts, piece by piece. The portrait remained, Clara and baby Jacob, but now it hung on the wall beside Mara's drawings. Her sketches soon filled the space. Deer leaping across snowbanks, the mountain man standing by the river, children laughing under pine boughs, a cabin with its windows glowing warm in the dusk. It became her studio, but more than that, it became her room, a place of creation, of memory, of healing. She painted through the day, while he worked outside, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing together. They were no longer broken pieces, held together by silence. They were something whole, something chosen, a family, reborn. The mountain hadn't changed much, but time had moved through it all the same, like water over stone, carving gently, patiently. The pines still swayed in the wind with their old familiar rhythm, and the river still sang its cold song through the rocks. But the cabin had grown, not in size, but in spirit. Where once there had been silence, now there was laughter. The schoolhouse sat just downhill from the garden, a sturdy structure of pine logs and wide windows, hand-built by neighbors and friends who had once believed the man on the mountain was a ghost. Now they came willingly, tools in hand, offering planks, nails, time. It had started as a simple dream of Mara's, a place where children could learn to read, to draw, to wonder. The town had rallied around it like a long overdue apology. Each morning, Mara rang the small brass bell hung on the porch beam, and children came running, boots thudding on packed dirt, voices lifting in excitement. They carried slates and pencils, pockets full of pine cones and stories. They weren't afraid of the mountain. It was home to them now, full of secrets, yes, but kind ones. Inside the schoolhouse, the walls were lined with books and paintings. The back corner was her favorite, a sunlit nook where drawings were pinned on clothespins, where children's imaginations bloomed in charcoal, ink, and color. They drew the mountain, the animals, each other. They drew the cabin, and always the man with the heavy boots and soft eyes. The mountain man, once feared, once myth, had grown gray. His beard was white at the chin now, and his shoulders stooped just slightly, but his presence had not diminished. If anything, it had settled deeper, like the roots of an old tree. He came most days to the schoolhouse, sitting by the fire as the children crowded near, listening to his deep voice roll through the pages of well-worn books. They called him Mr. or Grandpa, or simply Sir, with the kind of reverence born not from fear but love. He read slowly, always pointing to the words, letting little fingers follow along. And when he wasn't reading, he whittled toys, small animals, boats, tiny carved spoons. He gave them freely, never asking for thanks. Mara, now grown into herself, watched it all with a quiet joy. She no longer flinched at praise, no longer looked away when someone said her name. She stood at the front of the school each morning with chalk in her hand and steadiness in her soul. In the evenings, they still returned to the cabin. The fire still burned in the hearth. The old chair creaked the same way it always had, but the shadows no longer pressed in from the walls. They'd been replaced by drawings, laughter, light. Sometimes Mara would find the mountain man sitting alone on the porch, watching the trees. She'd sit beside him and he'd hand her a cup of tea without a word. They didn't need words anymore. They had built something better than a story. They had built a life. And though the world beyond the valley might forget their names, the mountain would remember. A recluse and an abandoned girl, once broken, now whole, made family by kindness, by quiet, and by the simple decision to stay.